Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film, The Wolverine. It's about Wolverine's adventures in Japan, which is based on the famous limited series by Chris Claremont and Frank Miller. Wolverine has been asked by a friend who he saved during the Nagasaki nuclear bomb attack. He saved him from the nuclear blast, and he has asked Wolverine to come back so he can say goodbye. Wolverine is tracked down by Yukio, who brings Wolverine back to Japan so he can meet this guy who he saved all those years ago, and is told that he can be cured of his healing factor so he can eventually grow old and die and not face this terrible immortality. Wolverine then refuses it, deciding he wants to keep his healing factor, but is poisoned anyway, and his healing factor doesn't work as well as it used to, and he's trying to make sure that Mariko, who is the granddaughter of this general guy, and he tries to protect her after a big fight breaks out at his funeral, and he goes and kind of runs away with her, protecting her to make sure nothing happens to her, because she is going to be given this big technology firm, which the guy who brought Wolverine to Japan has, and he's super rich and powerful, and he was going to give all of that to his granddaughter, which starts all sorts of bullshit within the family. Wolverine has to protect her while his healing factor is diminishing, hopefully get her out of this trouble before he himself dies with his diminishing healing factor. Now, this movie has a lot going against it from the onset. It's a continuity sequel to X-Men: The Last Stand, and I guess it is kind of a second Wolverine film, both of which, X-Men Origins Wolverine and X-Men: The Last Stand were both really bad movies that nobody liked. They were very cluttered, kind of bad studio blockbuster superhero films. Like a lot of sequels this summer, it decides to learn from the mistakes of the previous film, which was to make an actual Wolverine movie, not a movie cluttered with mutants and Wolverines in there also. This is solely about Wolverine. It's not really as much about anyone else, and that's really a good thing. That's something we always wanted from a solo Wolverine outing, and it's very self-contained, which is kind of surprising actually, considering how many superhero films want to do the continuity thing. Now, this is kind of in a certain amount of continuity, but it doesn't really care as much about setting up other movies. If you don't count that little sequence in the credits, it's not as focused on it as an Iron Man 3 or a Superman is. It's not giving Easter eggs to other stuff. It's solely being a Wolverine solo thing. This definitely has the feeling of a Wolverine comic book, or at least I haven't read a solo Wolverine comic book in quite a long time, but that's what I remember them as. They're very self-contained stories, and it works really well as a basic adaptation and as a Wolverine movie. But because it's so focused on Wolverine rather than having any other characters or being cluttered, it kind of does that to such an extreme that literally every character who isn't Wolverine is underdeveloped. Maybe Yukio is probably the best developed. I'd say Mariko is kind of second in that, but really Yukio is the only character I was really attached to who wasn't Wolverine. I kind of look at that as maybe that's a good thing, because I'd much rather have one really well-developed superhero than them trying to do all this other stuff. And it's kind of interesting because it's not really claiming any of these characters are well-developed. A lot of superhero movies, and especially big blockbuster movies, will kind of just cheat and act like they developed this character and kind of get to the big moment without developing it. It doesn't really do that. It's really focused on Wolverine. So yeah, it's not the greatest writing in the world, but it almost feels like the director, James Mangold, he kind of realized, like, yeah, there's actual storytelling problems with this script, but let's go with them rather than pretending we have a better written script, which is actually kind of nice that it's a solo outing. And I don't really remember reading a lot of Wolverine solo outings and being that attached to other characters. Part of me thinks, like, well, is that bad? Because my problem with most of superhero movies, and especially the last two kind of X-Men films in this weird continuity, I'm kind of not counting First Class. This is really more attached to that previous franchise. This is really a sequel, a follow-up to Last Stand. And in that continuity, it became too cluttered. You really want to tell a story about a character, and this film does that with Wolverine. So in a way, I think I like the storytelling in this. It's a lot leaner than we saw from a lot. I mean, it's not really lean, but compared to a lot of these cluttered superhero movies sometimes, this has much more leaner filmmaking. I think that really works for what it's trying to do. And James Mangold, you know, this is his first superhero movie. He's done like Kate and Leopold, he's done Which Is How We Knew Hugh Jackman. He directed Night and Day, did 3:10 to Yuma, he did Walk the Line. He's not really someone who, when it was announced he was doing this film, I was really excited about directing it. I was kind of like, oh no. But he really takes to it fairly well. I mean, he directs it like a kind of an average studio director. Other than the amazing bullet train sequence, which had all the fun that an awesome superhero action sequence can really have, a fun Wolverine awesome action sequence, and that part is great. But the rest of it, I noticed the staging is off, the cinematography during the fights isn't really inspired at all. It just looks like a normal kind of big blockbuster action sequence, and it's just about as boring as that sounds. He does try to make it a little darker. I noticed the color palette in this is a tad darker than I expect from most of the X-Men films. I think they kind of brighten up superhero films a little too much. It's not so much that it's really going to make much of a difference, and it does try to be more like an action-adventure story rather than a superhero film, a lot of the cinematography, but in too much of a subtle way. I think it should have been a little more aggressive with its adaptation. It still adheres to the superhero-ness of Wolverine, and I kind of think that is what holds this film back for me, and why I don't entirely just absolutely love it, is because it's like still basically like clawing on to an idea of a superhero movie. Another thing that it really learned from the previous films, and it's a comment Roger Ebert made a lot in his reviews, is the problem with Wolverine is he's healing, so there's not really a vulnerability there. His healing factor is really a problem, especially in the films. Like, his healing factor works too well. I don't remember in the comic books he'd have some weakness to him, and in the movies it seemed like they got rid of that entirely. Normally I really hate the cliche, the superhero movie cliche, or he lost his powers, or we took his powers, or because of his powers he did this thing that's like his powers. I really would just like them to go on an adventure, and I really hate the cliche of this. But I actually like the cliche of this because it was a problem with Wolverine in the movie. They made him vulnerable. They made him more human as a character, and they made him a lot more interesting. And it was a definite problem, especially in X-Men Origins. I mean, his healing factor went to ridiculous degrees. It goes to a ridiculous degree at the beginning when he saves that guy from nuclear explosion, but that sequence was really well done. I actually hadn't seen a healing factor sequence done with such great special effects before, and such a stunning special effect. It goes away, but it makes the stakes higher. If Wolverine was completely invulnerable, I don't think I would have cared about him as much as I do throughout this film. I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. I mean, it was his star-making role. He still has a lot of fun with it. He's the actor who's played a comic book character in more movies than anyone ever at this point, I think. I know he's played Wolverine in more movies than Christopher Reeve's played Superman, because he's done it in 5 movies at this point, and a cameo in First Class. So if you're counting Supergirl with Christopher Reeves, it doesn't work out for you, which is really impressive. It doesn't feel like he's lost the thrill of playing Wolverine. He still has that kind of charisma as Wolverine. He still seems to be as into it as he did from the first film. He seems to really love the character. Certainly you'd have to if you've been doing it for so long. I don't like certain things about this film. I don't like its superhero-ness. The third act gets a little too much with twists and all that crap. This was James Mangold's first superhero movie. For a first superhero movie, for someone who doesn't do big budget blockbusters normally, I think he did a really good job, actually. Especially a surprising job how good he was in certain parts. But at the same time, it holds on to that superhero-ness so much. Really, I would have liked if they played more with the concept, if they got into, like, you know, that he's a stranger in a strange land. They don't really do that. This isn't Black Rain meets Wolverine, which I think that's what I really wanted, especially a concept like this. But Ridley Scott is a really established director, and they also establish and set up all of that so you can have the cultural differences. They don't set that up. So the way this film is built, they don't really set that up in this film. They don't set up so you can have these major cultural differences in this movie. So the way this film is set up and written, it works within what it's trying to do, and artistic intent wise, you can tell this film really succeeded. But I'm still a little disappointed it didn't do, I guess, more, but maybe that's not fair. But the concept is there, and it's like lying right in front of you, so why didn't you do anything with it? I mean, I would recommend you all see Black Rain because I think it's kind of similar and a much better movie, but it's also, that's Ridley Scott in the 80s, and he had at that time done Alien and Blade Runner and was an incredibly strong director. James Mangold isn't as strong of a director, and I think for him, this is a good step forward. This is much better than Night and Day and a lot of the films I've seen from him, and I think he made a really good superhero movie for somebody who isn't a great director at that kind of a thing, and isn't a director I would have thought could have made a Wolverine movie this good. So for him, and for what it has and everything in it, I think it's a good movie, and I actually think it's one of the better superhero movies I've seen this summer. I still kind of wish someone did a better adaptation, a crazier adaptation, went a little more off the rails with it. Maybe if this movie wasn't PG-13, when Wolverine scratched people, there'd be blood, and it would be a little more interesting and moodier and such. But it's a mainstream 20th Century Fox, big budget, superhero Hollywood blockbuster. And in what it's trying to do, it is good at it. And I did have fun, and I did like it. But I still am kind of pining for the days, I guess, that you have a more hardcore, maybe artsier, moodier adaptation of Wolverine. The kind of idea I got from the comic books. That hasn't happened yet. But it's so much better than the last Wolverine film. It's really good at what it's trying to do. So I like it for that. I guess I am asking it to do something that it's not really doing. And maybe, you know, that is unfair. Regardless of all that, I like this movie. And I think if you like the X-Men films, you'll like this film. And it's honestly probably one of the more interesting superhero movies just because it's self-contained. It is what it is. And it's really not trying to be anything more. It's not trying to set up all this stuff. It's just concerned with its own story. And that's actually kind of a fun blockbuster superhero movie thing to see. So if you have seen The Wolverine and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. But seriously, Wolverine needs to get over Jean Grey. What's that about?